Our group had chapters 3, 4, and 5 covering the structural frame.
Yes, Ryan. I just got a report from the director of Morgan Stanley. 78 seems to have taken the brunt of the stuff. There's a lot of bodies. They said the stairway is clear all the way up, though. All right, 10-4, Scott. What floor are you on? 48 right now. All right, keep walking. We're coming up behind you.
The terrorist attacks of September 11, 2001 demonstrated with deadly results that failures in the command structure of New York City's emergency response organizations could harm those who sought to help. Both the New York Police Department and the Fire Department of New York had command centers which were located 3 blocks apart and were not able to effectively communicate with each other. Considering the deaths of 71 police officers, 343 firefighters and paramedics, the structure of emergency operations in New York City failed to meet its goals and objectives because there was not rationality regarding interagency cooperations and no clear divisions of labor. To be successful in the structural frame, organizations exist to achieve goals and objectives. In these organizations, rationality must prevail. Assigning roles which clarify divisions of labor is key, and problems are the result of poor structure. Our description of these next 3 chapters will describe in detail how to avoid the failures of September 11th and other organizational structural failures.
My section was chapter 3, which was basically getting organized in terms of the structural frame. The structural frame is the idea that if arranged the right way, an organization can and will be successful. There is no best way to organize the structure, but instead, careful consideration must be thought about for every different case of leadership. So these considerations include the organization's goals, strategies, technology, people, and environment. There are structural assumptions that support this frame. So assumptions meaning things that a leader must think about, and then assumptions in the meaning that they're just assumed that these things are happening within an organization. So the first structural assumption is that organizations exist to achieve established goals and objectives. So the organization's purpose and mission. Organizations increase efficiency and enhance performance through specialization and appropriate division of labor. So as a leader, making sure that you've got your people doing the right things. Number 3, suitable forms of coordination and control ensure that diverse efforts of individuals mesh. So this is speaking to the leader's job to make sure that you have control over your people and that you're putting them where they need to be in order to mesh and be effective. Organizations work best when rationality prevails over personal agendas and extraneous pressures. So making sure that basically ethics as a leader, that you are using your mission and vision to drive what you're doing and not your own personal gain or letting other people's personal gain drive what you're doing. Effective structures fit an organization's current circumstances. So what this means is that if your structure is effective, it's changing based upon what is needed. And then troubles arise and performance suffers from structural deficits, remedied through problem solving and restructuring. And my group partners will be getting more into detail about that in their chapters. The second part of the chapter was about vertical and lateral coordination. And basically, it's by taking these assumptions, a leader has to figure out what types of leadership that they need to use when they're leading. And so there's two different types: vertical, meaning authority, rules and policy, planning, and court control systems. So these are things like top-down management, making sure that you have a clear expectation for your employees. And then lateral coordination is that kind of feel good, making sure everyone's on the same page, using task forces to solve major problems, coordinating roles for people. And matrix structures and networks is um, really designing where people are in your organization and how you are utilizing them and making sure that they're being efficient.
This is Brian Ward. I did chapter 4 in the Bolman and Deal, and that chapter is on structuring and restructuring. And basically what they say is designing a structure is difficult and can be hazardous. Reorganizing and restructuring is powerful but also very high risk. So I'm going to talk about structural dilemmas that organizations may confront. First off was differentiation versus integration, basically saying the more complex a role structure is, the harder it is to sustain a focused, tightly coupled enterprise, and the more costly it is. Gap versus overload. An example of that would be after 9/11, when Department of Homeland Security was formed. It was formed to fill a gap due to country security. However, even after the organization was formed, there's still a gap that exists, as the FBI and CIA are still separate entities. Underuse and overload. An example of that would be a hospital where office staff would be underused and become bored and have a lot of free time at work, where nursing staff is very overloaded and hostility exists within the organization. A restructuring idea would be reassigning clerical duties from the nurses to the office staff, which would balance out the workload. Next is lack of clarity versus lack of creativity. Just talking about if employees are unclear about what they're supposed to do, or even if the job description is too rigid, it can create a lack of service or a suffering in the product. Excessive autonomy versus excessive interdependence. The example that Bolman and Deal talked about was actually within education. Teachers feeling lonely and unsupported because they work in a self-contained classroom and they rarely see other adults. Also, on the opposite, too tightly connected can be a distraction or causing the organization to spend too much time on unnecessary coordinations. Too loose versus too tight. Basically, that dilemma says too loose, people go astray. Too tight, there's no flexibility or creativity. And then goalless, goal-bound just talks about a lack of goals versus too goal-driven. So when talking about structure, Bolman and Deal brought up two names, Mintzberg and Helgeson. Majority of the chapter is discussing Mintzberg's model, which I'm going to talk about, and just a little bit is talked about of Helgeson's web of inclusions. So most of my time I'll spend on Mintzberg's model of these 5 structures. Mintzberg's fives is what they call it. So first off, we have the operating core at the very bottom. And what the operating core does is provide services to customers or the clients. Right above the operating core, you have the middle line. The middle line supervises, coordinates, and provides resources for operators. And at the top, you have the strategic apex. And they determine the mission and shape the grand design of the organization. Then you have 2 areas on both sides of the organization of the model. On one side you have the support staff, and on the other side you have technostructure. And technostructure are the specialists and analysts who standardize, measure, and inspect outputs and procedures. How this model looks within a school is The operating core would be the teachers. They are the ones providing the services to the customers or clients, which would be the students. The middle line would be the principal. They are the ones supervising, coordinating, providing the resources for the teachers. At the top, the strategic apex would be the superintendent and the school board. They're the ones determining the mission and shaping the design of the school. The support staff would be the secretarial staff, nurses, cooking staff, and custodians. Then on the other side, you have technostructure. Bolman and Deal actually did not discuss what technostructure would be within the school, but I would see it as probably the instructional coaches or even the AEA. They're the ones that are the specialists, and they're analyzing and analysts who standardize and measure and inspect those outputs and procedures. So next we have Mintzberg's 5 structural configurations, and this uses that model, but in each configuration a certain part of the structure could be larger than others, or even some parts of the structure even missing. So first we have the simple structure. Simple is the only strategic apex in the operating level. The issue with a simple structure is that the boss can become too close to the day-to-day operations and easily distracted by immediate problems. Next is the machine bureaucracy. A famous company that uses this structure would be McDonald's. The issue with machine bureaucracy would be that motivating and satisfying the workers in the operating core. Machine bureaucracy looks very similar to what Mintzberg's model is on the last slide. Next, we have professional bureaucracy. Harvard is a famous example of this, and this has a large operating core, but a small technostructure and supporting staff on the sides. The issue with this is that few management levels between the strategic apex and the professors, which would be that operating core, a decentralized profile, and a slow response to external change. Next is divisionalized form. This one's kind of interesting because it's the model that's on the last slide, but there's those own structures, smaller models within the operating levels. This creates a cat and mouse game. Headquarters can also lose touch with operations. The last one is adhocracy. This is a very loose and flexible model. Basically, it's very up for interpretation. Outside of Mintzberg's structure, there's the Helgeson's web of inclusion. And Helgeson argued that the idea of hierarchy is primarily a male-driven depiction, and quite different from structures created by female executives. The web, it's basically like a spider web. The web builds from the center and then just works its way on out within the structure. So as I said a couple slides ago, restructuring is a very difficult task to accomplish. It is powerful, but it's very high risk. But these are the reasons why restructuring would happen. The first reason would be environmental. AT&T was a classic example of this. Environmental would be a mandated shift from a regulated monopoly to market with multiple competitors. So AT&T, which saw a lot more competition as they got larger, so they restructured their organization to fit that shift. Next would be technology changes. There's a big technology change with the aircraft industry from their shift from piston to jet engines, and the company that really restructured itself to fit that shift was Boeing, and now Boeing is in the lead in the aircraft industry. Next is the growth of organizations. Many organizations, smaller organizations, have more of an adhocracy structure, but as they grow, they need to restructure into one of those other models. Digital equipment saw this. The last one is leadership changes. It's quite common for new leaders to come in and want to put their own stamp on the organization, even if it's not needed. So they might restructure the organization to help put their own stamp within it.
Chapter 5 in Bolman and Deal addressed the considerations that need to be taken when forming groups or teams, and the next slide contains the major points that were offered by the authors. Work in most organizations, which includes schools, is accomplished through group or team efforts. However, one factor in dictating whether or not these efforts will be successful is the type of group structure that is chosen. So when deciding which group structure to employ, Bolman and Deal relay that the nature of the work or the task provides a key to shaping group structure. Tasks vary in clarity, in predictability, and also in their stability. The task structure relationships in small groups is parallel to that in larger organizations. And while the relationships between small and larger groups do parallel each other, it's key to understand that the more complicated tasks become, the more complex group structures will be. So in deciding the type of group structure to use, groups must assess their specific context in addition to the given task. The authors offer some helpful questions to consider, such as what is our goal? Who should do what? Who is in charge? How should we make decisions? And what are the special skills and talents of each group member? It's these type of questions that help groups to consider if a hierarchy, a network, or some other type of group structure would best fit the group and the task. Bolman and Deal also offer a few examples of fundamental team configurations in the context of simple structural needs. The first example is a one-boss arrangement, which involves one person having authority over others in the structure. This type of structure works well with simple situations because information typically flows from the top and group members communicate directly with the boss. This type of structure does not work well, however, when complex circumstances arise because the boss will not typically have the resources or the time to direct everyone on his or her own, and subordinates might become frustrated with the lack of direction and progress. An alternative to the one boss arrangement is the dual authority structure, which creates multiple positions in a middle management level. This structure works well when tasks are divisible because it frees the boss's time to focus on the mission. However, adding a management layer creates slower communication and slower progress. A third option for structure is a simple hierarchy that employs one middle manager who supervises others and reports to the boss. This type of structure can be very efficient, but again, it limits access to the boss. In addition, issues sometimes arise between top and middle managers, which can create negative outcomes. A circle network is an alternative to the top-down structure. In this type of structure, information and decisions move from one person to another, and no one member of the group bears more control or responsibility than another member. Each group member has the authority to change or to add information as they participate, and this structure requires simple communication because each member only communicates with two other group members. A caution to this type of structure, though, is that the group is only as strong as its weakest link, and tasks that require more reciprocity are not typically well served with a circle network. The last type of fundamental team configuration that the authors explain is an all-channel network group design. In this structure, information and communication are free-flowing between all group members. All-channel networks work well with complicated tasks, but they can be overcomplicated and time-consuming for simple work. All-channel networks also require group members to have good communication skills. They must enjoy participation and be able to tolerate ambiguity, and they also must embrace diversity and be able to manage conflict. The final group structure that Bolman and Deal describe is a self-managing team. They cite the following characteristics from Kirkman and Shapiro that teams manage themselves by assigning jobs to members. They plan and schedule their own work. They make production or service-related decisions, and they take action to solve any issues that may arise. So while self-managing teams sound ideal, the structure is quite complicated to enact, and it requires a lot of resources, which may sometimes be allocated by a larger parent organization. When this group structure is formed well, however, it does produce better results and morale than more traditional group structures. In Chapter 5, the authors further explain that teams and groups are not the same. They cite a book called The Wisdom of Teams, which states that a team is a small number of people with complementary skills. They are committed to a common purpose, a set of performance goals, and also an approach for which they will hold themselves mutually accountable. So they do not just work together, rather they work together in accountable ways because their combined skills are well suited for a purpose and a way of accomplishing that purpose to which they are all driven. In addition to the specific task, the group member interactions dictate the type of structure that should be used. So the authors use various sports to analyze group structures. They say that the game determines the type of group structure that should be used. So for example, baseball is a team game, but team members are loosely connected and synchronization only occurs with a few team members at a time. An example of this may be the pitcher and the catcher communicating about which pitch to use, or the shortstop fielding a ball and then relaying it to the second baseman to get the out. American football, however, requires a high degree of planning and synchronization, and it often uses special teams. So team members need to be able to work together, and then they also need to be able to come up with plans for their next steps. Of even more interconnectedness is basketball. Basketball is reciprocal, it's fluid, it's a spontaneous game that requires team members to know their teammates and also to be able to anticipate their teammates' next moves. So when deciding which group structure to use, we must understand our team's goals. Does the goal require loosely connected actions? Does it require synchronization like American football? Or does it require that we anticipate each other's next moves like basketball? Finally, task situations are always changing, so groups and leaders, we must be able to continually assess whether the group structure is still the best option for the goal, and if it's not, then we have to vary the structure in response to the changes in the task and the circumstances that we are facing.
To summarize, let's review the example from the beginning of our presentation with the changes made to the New York City Police Department and Fire Department after September 11th. The mission statement of the police department is to enhance the quality of life in New York City by working in partnership with community to enforce the law, preserve peace, reduce fear, and maintain order. The New York City Fire Department's mission statement is as first responders to fires, public safety and medical emergencies, disasters, and terrorist acts, FDNY protects the lives and property of New York City residents and visitors. The department advances public safety through its fire prevention, investigation, and education programs. A commission that studied the function and failures of emergency responses after 9/11 determined that the structure of emergency management in New York City had to change after 9/11. The deaths of over 400 public safety employees pushed the fire department and police departments in New York City to move beyond their typical divisions of labor and turf battles. When evaluated, the nature of the work called for the NYPD and the FDNY to operate two separate agencies that, when called to work together, would rely on the Office of Emergency Management, now the New York City Emergency Management, to provide the structure and support to work together. For large emergencies that require both police and fire, the emergency management coordinates both fire and police in one command center that both seeks to save and protect life while allowing each branch to do the work they do best. A small change in restructuring will hopefully allow the public safety officers to meet their goals and objectives in future disasters.